just going back to the question you raised about clusters, one of the interesting things, which I'm not sure you really explored in the book, but which you just sort of triggered in my mind, Steph, is the whole question of whether or not there is some imitative effect in relation to these sorts of processes, like Trump's kind of, willingness to kind of make links with all sorts of, dictative strong-arm characters, people moving in a negative direction. Did you see any evidence of linkages between these clusters or individuals within these clusters to kind of reinforce the processes that were taking place?
Yeah, there's just no question about this. And in fact, to trumpet a new research project I'm working on, I've become quite interested in these mechanisms of learning internationally. For example, we're seeing a resurgence of authoritarian international institutions. We tend to think of international institutions as a piece of the liberal toolkit because they've been central to sustaining what we've come to call the post-war liberal order. But now we're seeing a counter movement with organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Gulf Cooperation Council, Venezuela's ALBA, which of course has fallen on hard times. There are a number of organizations in Africa that are playing this role and in the former Soviet republics. So there are lots of mechanisms through which these kinds of ideas can be transmitted, including even organizational ones. But certainly, I think that Bolivia and Ecuador learned in an adverse way from Chavez, and we document very particular ways in which certain tools were adopted across countries. And Poland, I think, very clearly followed Hungary, and Hungary itself, in some sense, followed Putin. And so this is a big topic of research. We just touch on it lightly. And there are other ways in which these problems are manifest internationally, not just through the international institutions, but for example, through media and through social media interference in elections, which has obviously become a topic of concern and was a topic of concern in the United States in 2016.
And these guys also pal up with each other and support each other. You could see that with Trump and Bolsonaro.
Exactly.
Or with Putin, sort of the buddy thing. So I think they make their own alliances and hide with them together.
And just the demonstration effect, Paula. I mean, the term fake news. Mm-hmm. Someone should write a paper on this, but just the term fake news has proliferated. And Bob and I have seen leaders like Duterte in the Philippines using the term fake news in English, clearly copying the playbook of President Trump. So, it's just disturbing and has much wider effect that the United States underwent this process.
Yeah, just a footnote, so Bolsonaro likes to call himself, described Trump, the Trump of South America.
He does.
So very explicitly a model. One other sort of international factor, Kevin, that is, I think, under-researched is I think there are international entrepreneurs who are playing a role in this. And I'm thinking specifically of someone like Steve Bannon, who goes around selling this idea. So we're really entering, if we haven't already entered, an international environment which creates a lot of very strong influences in the direction of backsliding.
Well, we spent a long time celebrating globalization, but there's just as much to be worried about from globalization.
Yes.
But that also raised a very interesting question around norm entrepreneurs. We assume that, with the literature on norm entrepreneurs normally suggests that they're reinforcing some notion of a kind of a liberal international order. And now you're saying there are a large number of norm entrepreneurs who are actually promoting values and beliefs and attitudes which are completely inimical, not only to the international order, but to the democratic sort of institutions that have given their oxygen.
I don't think the academic community has fully internalized this shift, particularly in the study of international politics. But we really are, in some ways, in a world which resembles the 30s, in the sense that you're seeing a high point of democracy that was reached in the wake of Versailles, gradually fall apart. Starting with Italy, and by 1939, even before the war started, the collapse of a number of democracies across Europe in this fashion. And it's obvious that that has consequences, partly for reasons that Paula mentioned, that they team up. There's ideological diffusion. There's common organizational efforts to protect themselves. A whole variety of ways in which this authoritarian democratic binary can have huge effects for international politics.
And that's a pretty terrifying parallel to think about the 30s and what happened afterwards and where we are now. If we're following that model, then we're in for all kinds of difficulties beyond.
Yeah, and it's something we have to think very hard about. I mean, democracies have to get along with autocracies, as well as stand up to them. And so there's a concern of both being too weak in terms of pushing back, for example, on things like the interference in the 2016 election, but at the same time risks in saying we cannot make common cause on any issue because a country is autocratic, which is also similarly wrong-headed. In fact, with respect to China, this is a major concern in the United States at the moment.
In terms of the different grievances that fuel reactionary populism and xenophobic nationalism, what do you see as the role of the economic grievances and inequalities and the identity markers associated with them as a sort of a fundamental driver of polarization, marginalization, and disrespect for rule of law and so forth?
We tried a lot to try to unpack these things, and the sort of the economic grievances and the ethnic and racial grievances. I won't speak for Steph, but I came to the conclusion that you can't really unpack them, that they interact, they go together, they reinforce one another. I mean, that's obvious, I think, in the United States, where we have long-standing racial and ethnic divisions, but these clearly became exacerbated after the Great Recession and sort of with the strains of globalization. I think that that's a lot what goes on in the other countries. In some places polarization is driven more by one thing than another. In Latin America, I think economics played a bigger role, although ethnicity was hugely important in Bolivia. And post-communist Europe, I think ethnicity and sort of ethnic conflicts drove a lot of this. But let me just make one other point about this, that it's important to kind of bear in mind that grievances have to be there in order for there to be polarization. You can't manufacture polarization out of nothing. But in most of the cases, a huge factor also was the stoking of grievances by demagogic politicians like Trump or like Bolsonaro or like Viktor Orban, that articulated real grievances, real divisions within society. They didn't make them up, but they magnified them enormously. And so I think that there's polarization that comes from below, but also a very important component of that is politicians exploiting the grievances in ways that that divide the society.
Polarization is just by far the most complex piece of this book because it's obviously a topic that many people are working on. There are a lot of debates in the United States about what the sources of polarization are, whether it's elite or mass, and those debates are being replicated broadly. But let me make a couple of supplementary points to Bob's. One is that we thought long and hard about whether we would try to make what I would call a taproot argument. And by a taproot argument, I mean, going back to Hobson's book on imperialism, is there some common factor to which this phenomena can be attributed? And essentially, we gave up. And we gave up for reasons that are suggested by Tolstoy's famous dictum that happy families are all the same, unhappy families are unhappy in their own particular way. And so while I agree with Bob that these things do reinforce each other and interact, the sources of polarization are actually quite diverse across countries. In some cases, the divide is nationalist cosmopolitan. In others, the divide is racial ethnic. In others, it's more weighted on the economic issues and class inequalities. But the most significant thing is not to us the sources of that polarization, but the way that they're translated into the political arena. And by that, I mean what has come to be known as affective polarization, where whatever the source of grievances, citizens and politicians come to view their political adversaries as enemies, as disloyal, as unpatriotic, as other. And that's really the destructive phase, because if you get to that point, and you believe that your adversary's program is inimical to the stability of the republic, then it's easy to acquiesce to measures which would otherwise be seen as anti-democratic measures. And so this is sort of the key point about polarization is if it reaches a certain level or extreme, it actually is enabling of the kind of majoritarian claims that most autocrats typically make.
You know, I've worked all over the world, and dehumanization comes up everywhere where there's been armed conflict, because you don't kill until you dehumanize. So this business of creating polarization, creating dehumanization in order to fulfill the destiny you wish for the country, which can be authoritarianism, overthrow, whatever, it's got to be there. So
I think this is really, this is the nub of the issue. I mean, we're never going to resolve in a definitive way, in my view, whether the polarization is mass or elite and what its ultimate sources are. There are just many sources for these grievances, but it's how they're packaged into the political arena. And that's why Bob's point about this coming from above is quite crucial, because it's typically mobilized by political entrepreneurs who are using these grievances to advance their political careers. That's really a distinguishing feature across all of the cases we looked at.
I'm so curious to try to understand why there's no Asian cases. Where's India? Where's Philippines? I understand Myanmar and China never had any democracy to begin with, but India and Philippines have had electoral something or other, haven't they?
We were kind of locked in by our method. India and the Philippines definitely should be in this sample.
Yeah.
But in terms of the sort of the timing with which we collected the information on the cases, they fell out. If we were to redo this, both of those countries would be in the sample and considered backsliding cases. And in many respects, they fit, the model, or the model fits them, that we've been talking about: polarization, control of the legislature, incremental abuses of power. All of these things do a lot to describe both of those cases. I think particularly India. where you're seeing a kind of a gradual slide in an autocratic direction. So,
by the way, with
yeah,
religion playing a quite central role in the Indian case, actually. Again, talking about different sources of polarization, but the attacks on Muslims in India have become, a central piece of the whole backsliding process there. In the Philippines, somewhat different, a very interesting phenomena that has come to be known as penal populism, where drug users were targeted as a sort of other, and a whole unraveling of rights around in the criminal justice system associated with an attack on the drug problem in the Philippines, played a somewhat similar polarizing purpose between those who are committed to rule of law and those who believe that this campaign against drugs warranted strong measures or extreme measures.